Imagine a punishment worse than death. One that doesn't just break your body, but erases your name from society and damns your soul for eternity. For centuries, the Inquisition mastered not only physical torture but the art of absolute psychological destruction. Forget the myths you've seen in movies. Today, we are opening the Inquisition's own archives to reveal its 10 most disturbing, historically verified punishments. What did it truly mean to be relaxed to the secular arm? And how could a simple yellow tunic be more feared than any torture device? Prepare yourself for the horrifying, documented truth behind the Inquisition's power, as we count down the methods that held a continent in fear. Fact 2. The theater of fear was not built on chaos, but on a chilling and divine logic. Imagine a world lit only by candles and faith. A world where the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral was the sky, and the Word of God was the only law. The air itself feels heavy, thick with the scent of incense, melting wax, and the cold, damp smell of ancient stone. In this world, there was one authority that stood above all others, an institution with power that dwarfed that of kings and emperors. It was the holy office of the Inquisition, and its jurisdiction was not the land, but the human soul itself. Its agents were not soldiers, but priests and lawyers. Their weapons were not swords, but doctrine, ink, and a profound understanding of fear. Their mandate came directly from God, to protect the flock from the deadliest of all plagues, heresy. A single word whispered in the wrong company, a book read in secret, a doubt allowed to fester in the heart. Any of these could invite a knock on the door in the dead of night. How could an institution dedicated to salvation become the architect of such suffering? The answer lies in a terrifying reversal of purpose. The Inquisition's primary goal, as stated in its own meticulous records, was not to punish the sinner but to purify the soul. It was a court of mercy, but a mercy that had to be extracted. A confession was the only path back to God, and the body was seen as a stubborn, temporary vessel that held the eternal soul hostage. To save the soul, the body had to be broken. Suddenly, the most devout citizen, a pillar of their community, could find themselves stripped of their name, their property, and their humanity, all based on an anonymous accusation. Their status as a child of God was inverted, and they became a vessel of potential corruption that had to be cleansed by any means necessary. The pious doctors of theology and law who orchestrated this process believed they were performing a sacred duty, a form of spiritual surgery. They were not torturers in their own eyes. They were healers, and the tools they developed to perform this healing, the systematic and bureaucratic methods for dismantling a human being, would become the stuff of legend. They created a precise and horrifying ladder of pain designed to lead the sinner from denial to confession. Fact 3. The 10th punishment on our list was not an instrument of pain, but a simple article of clothing. It was a weapon designed not to break bones, but to methodically dismantle a person's identity, their place in the world, and their family's future. It was called the San Benito. At first glance, it appeared almost holy. A coarse tunic of sackcloth, dyed a lurid yellow, the color of sulfur and treason. It was cut like a monastic scapular, a garment of piety. But this was a twisted devotion, a uniform for the damned. For the penitent heretic, the one who confessed and begged for reconciliation, the cloth was painted with a simple, blood-red cross. But for those who were unrepentant or condemned to burn, the symbols were a hellscape brought to life. Crude, terrifying demons were painted dancing among licking flames, a visual preview of the damnation that awaited. The moment this garment was forced over the victim's head, their transformation was complete. They ceased to be a person, a neighbor, a father, or a wife. They became a walking effigy, a living billboard advertising their sin for all to see. Imagine the sensory assault, the rough, itching fabric scraping against the skin, the jeers and stones of the crowd, the faces of former friends turning away in fear and disgust. How could a simple piece of cloth become a weapon of such profound social destruction? Its true power was not in the wearing, but in its legacy. The punishment did not end when the sentence was served and the garment was removed. The San Benito, emblazoned with the sinner's name, was then taken to the local parish church and hung from the vaulted ceilings for all to see. For generations, these faded yellow tunics would hang like grotesque ghosts above the heads of the faithful. An eternal, public archive of heresy. It was a hereditary stain. The sin of the ancestor became the shame of the descendant, barring them from honorable professions, from public office, and from good marriage. It was a social death sentence, a curse passed down through the bloodline. And this slow, grinding erasure of a family's name was considered one of the Inquisition's lighter sentences. It was a horror reserved for those who eventually bent the knee. For those who stubbornly refused, the Church's methods would become far more direct, moving from the fabric of society to the fabric of the body itself. Fact 4. The 9th and 8th punishments transformed the human body into a public message, written in flesh and enforced by silence. For the heretic whose sins were deemed worthy of physical correction, the process began with sound. It was the sound of a procession, the shuffling feet of guards on cobblestone, the murmuring of a crowd, and then a sharp, percussive crack that echoed off the stone walls, the sound of the whip. This was scourging, a ritual of choreographed violence. Stripped to the waist, the condemned was led through the city, their every step a station in a pilgrimage of pain. The number of lashes was prescribed with bureaucratic precision, each one laid on by a professional who knew how to inflict maximum pain without granting the mercy of unconsciousness. The hot sun, the dust of the street, the stinging, biting kiss of the lash, all of it was a performance. What is the true purpose of a punishment performed in public? It was a sermon delivered not with words, but with blood. The sinner's back became a temporary scripture, a living text warning all who watched of the price of dissent. The body was no longer private, it was a canvas for the Church's power. But sometimes, a victim would refuse to play their part. They would not scream in pain, but cry out in defiance, attempting to turn their humiliation into a moment of martyrdom. How do you silence a heretic who welcomes pain? The Inquisition's answer was the 8th punishment on our list, a tool of absolute control, the mordaza. It was an iron gag, a cage for the head. A heavy strap was buckled behind the neck, forcing an iron plate against the mouth, crushing the lips against the teeth. Often, a metal bit was forced between the jaws, clamping the tongue down. Some versions were even more vicious, featuring an iron prong, crudely sharpened, that would pierce the tongue if the victim dared to speak. Suddenly, the chaotic sounds of the procession were replaced by a terrifying, enforced quiet. The victim, now gagged and bleeding, was rendered a silent participant in their own degradation. The Inquisition had stolen their voice, their last and most human form of resistance. These brutal displays of public theater, however, were for the masses. They were a warning. The true, methodical work of breaking a soul did not happen in the open air. It took place in the suffocating darkness of a cell, a living tomb where the only sounds were the ones inside your own head. Fact 5. The 7th punishment was a form of mercy, a reprieve from the public square. For the heretic who was spared the whip and the gag, the sentence was often imprisonment. But what happens when the body is not touched at all, when the violence is turned inward? The mercy of the cell was a lie. It was a descent into a living tomb, a place designed for the slow, methodical erosion of the human soul. Imagine the moment the heavy oak door slams shut, the bolt scraping across the iron hasp, plunging the world into absolute, suffocating darkness. This was the first assault. The darkness was total, a thick, palpable blackness that erased the concept of day and night. The only companion was the relentless, seeping cold of the stone walls, a damp chill that worked its way past the skin and into the bone. The only sound was the rhythmic, maddening drip of water somewhere in the shadows. A sound that would become both a clock and a tormentor. This was the world of the prisoner, a sensory deprivation chamber where the mind was left alone with only itself to feed on. The sentence itself was the true instrument of torture. It was often to a perpetual prison, This did not always mean for the rest of one's natural life, but its horror lay in its deliberate ambiguity. The prisoner was never told the length of their stay. Would it be 5 years? 20? Would they ever see the sun again? How long can a mind survive when left alone with nothing but infinite shapeless time? Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, until time itself lost all meaning. Memories of the outside world, the warmth of sunlight, the taste of fresh bread, the face of a loved one would begin to fade, becoming thin and dreamlike. The prisoner's own identity would fray and unravel. They entered as a person, but over the years, they would be reduced to a ghost, a creature whose entire existence was confined to 4 damp, suffocating walls. This slow, grinding decay was a calculated process. It was designed to cultivate a despair so profound that the prisoner would confess to anything, sign anything, just to feel the sun on their face one last time. But this psychological unraveling was a slow poison. It took years. For secrets that needed to be unlocked quickly, for a confession the Inquisition deemed urgent, they could not wait for the mind to rot. They required a more direct approach. A conversation held not with the soul, but with the flesh. Fact 6. The greatest horror of the Inquisition was not its cruelty, but its meticulous, bureaucratic logic. The agonies we are about to witness were, in the eyes of their perpetrators, not punishments at all. Punishment was a sentence for the guilty, a final judgment. What happened in the stone chambers deep within the Inquisition's halls was something else entirely. A legal procedure. It was interrogation. This was a crucial distinction, a moral and judicial firewall that allowed men of God to orchestrate unspeakable acts with a clear conscience. Imagine the scene. This is not a filthy dungeon, but a formal chamber. The Inquisitor, a university-educated lawyer and theologian, sits at a table. Beside him, a notary, his quill scratching on parchment, is poised to record every word, every scream. A doctor is also present. His role to assess the victim's physical limits, to advise when they were near death, and to ensure the subject did not expire before a confession could be secured. How could a legal system, a court of God, sanction such brutality? It did so by creating rules. The most important of these rules, a nod to compassion in the canon law, was that torture could be applied only once. One session to break the will of the heretic. But what if the heretic was strong? What if one session was not enough? Here, the brilliant, cold-blooded legalism of the Inquisition revealed itself. They engineered a semantic loophole. If a prisoner was taken down from the rack before confessing, the session was not officially considered finished. The notary's pen would scratch across the page, noting that the interrogation was merely being suspended. The torture was paused, to be continued at a later time. The next day, or the day after that, the prisoner would be brought back, and the procedure would be reconvened. Through this chilling fiction, a single session could be stretched over days or weeks of agony. The victim's body was no longer that of a sinner being punished, but a source of information being mined. A stubborn lock that the right application of pain could surely open. This single, deliberate lie, this piece of bureaucratic genius, was the key that unlocked the deepest horrors of the Inquisition. It gave educated, pious men the moral and legal permission they needed, transforming them from priests into technicians of pain. With the rules of the game now clear, the real work of extracting the truth could begin. Fact 7. The sixth method of interrogation began not with a blade or fire, but with a simple linen cloth and a jar of water. With the legal framework in place, the inquisitors could proceed. The first instrument brought to bear on the uncooperative heretic was the toca, the water cure. The victim was strapped to a slanted board, their head positioned lower than their feet. Then, a long piece of linen, the toca, was forced into their mouth, the rough fabric scraping against their throat as it was pushed deep inside. With the airway now obstructed, the questioning would begin. After each denial, the inquisitor would give a calm signal, and an assistant would begin to slowly pour water onto the cloth. How can you drown a man without a single drop of water entering his lungs? The genius of the toca was that it made the victim's own body their tormentor. the cloth would become saturated, and with every frantic, reflexive gasp for air, the prisoner would pull the suffocating weight of the water deeper, creating the pure, primal, and inescapable terror of drowning. Their chest would burn, their vision would narrow, and their body would convulse against the straps. But there was no escape. The world was reduced to a desperate, silent scream for a single breath. If this psychological horror failed to yield a confession, the inquisitors would move from the illusion of death to the mechanical reality of deconstruction. The victim, still gasping, would be unbound and carried to the fifth instrument on our list: the potro, the rack. It was a simple, brutal machine of wood and rope. The prisoner's wrists and ankles were tightly bound to rollers at either end of the heavy frame. The inquisitor, now a detached technician, would give the order. The only sound in the chamber would be the slow, groaning creak of the wooden gears and the tightening of the ropes. What sound does a human body make when it is pulled apart? First came the stretching of the muscles, pulled taut to the point of tearing. Then, with another turn, came the sickening hollow pop. As the shoulders were pulled from their sockets, followed by the elbows, the knees, the hips, each dislocation was a separate, blinding explosion of pain, methodically delivered on the inquisitor's command. The doctor would monitor the victim's pulse, ensuring they remained conscious to experience every moment, while the notary documented each turn of the wheel. Even after this, after being systematically disassembled joint by joint, some victims would remain silent. For this ultimate defiance, the Inquisition reserved its masterpiece of pain, a device that needed no gears or levers but used the simple force of gravity to achieve a level of agony even the rack could not deliver. Fact 8. The fourth and most feared instrument of interrogation was not a machine at all. After the mechanical complexity of the rack, this method was terrifying in its simplicity. It required no gears, no levers, no intricate wooden frame. It needed only a rope, a sturdy ceiling beam, and the simple, universal law of gravity. This was the garrucha, better known as the strappado. The procedure began with the victim's hands being bound tightly behind their back, the coarse rope biting into their wrists. The other end of the rope was thrown over a pulley attached high overhead. There was no slow, creaking buildup of tension. There was only the sight of the inquisitor's assistants taking hold of the rope and pulling. Slowly, agonizingly, the victim was hoisted into the air. What happens when the law of gravity becomes an instrument of torture? The moment the prisoner's feet left the unforgiving stone floor, their own body weight became the weapon. All of their mass, every bit of bone and muscle, was now hanging from their shoulder joints, which were twisted backward into a completely unnatural position. The pain was not a gradual pressure but an instantaneous, blinding explosion of white-hot agony. The shoulders would dislocate almost immediately, the ligaments tearing, the bones grinding as they were wrenched from their sockets. The victim was now a completely helpless object, suspended in the air, a puppet whose strings were held by the calm, dispassionate men below. But the inquisitors were masters of their craft, and they had developed methods to escalate this torment to an almost unimaginable degree. Sometimes, heavy weights would be shackled to the prisoner's ankles, adding the force of iron to the force of flesh, increasing the pull and ensuring the damage was catastrophic and permanent. Even more brutal, however, was the drop. The prisoner would be hoisted to the very top of the chamber, their head nearly scraping the ceiling. Then, without warning, the rope would be released. For a heart-stopping second, they would plummet toward the floor, only for the rope to be jerked taut at the last possible moment. The sudden, violent stop sent a shockwave of force through the entire body, shattering the already ruined joints, tearing muscles from the bone, and delivering a jolt of pain so absolute it would often render the victim unconscious. This was the Inquisition's ultimate tool for breaking a body. It was the final, brutal key for unlocking a confession. But now, the interrogation is over. For those who confessed and for those who were condemned, the process shifts. It moves beyond the secret chamber and back into the light, away from breaking the body and toward the ceremonial destruction of the soul itself. Fact 9. The third punishment left no scars on the body, but was designed to inflict a mortal wound upon the soul. For the medieval mind, there was a terror that ran deeper than any physical pain, a fate more absolute than any torture. It was the sentence of excommunication. This was not merely being cast out of a church, it was a spiritual annihilation. What does it mean to be erased from the book of life? In an age where heaven and hell were as real as the ground under one's feet, this was a verdict of eternal damnation. The excommunicated was severed from the body of Christ, unable to receive the sacraments that were the only path to salvation. They were to be shunned by all, their presence a source of spiritual contamination. No one could offer them food, shelter, or comfort without risking their own soul. When they died, their body could not be buried in consecrated ground. They became a ghost while still living, a pariah to both God and man. This profound spiritual violence, however, was a prelude to the Inquisition's greatest public statement. From the damnation of the individual soul, we move to the second punishment on our list, a spectacle involving the entire community. It was a massive piece of religious theater called the auto da fe, the act of faith. This was not the execution itself, as is often believed. It was the grand, day-long ceremony of public penance and sentencing. On the day of the auto da fe, the entire city would shut down. A vast procession would snake through the streets at dawn, a living display of the social order. Friars carrying banners, local dignitaries, and finally, the prisoners themselves, barefoot and clad in the symbolic yellow San Benito, each garment telling the story of their crime and sentence. The procession would end at a massive, specially constructed stage in the main square. Here, before crowds of thousands, a long mass would be held, sermons would be preached, and then, one by one, the condemned would be brought forward. Their names and crimes would be read aloud for all to hear. Some would be reconciled and sentenced to public penance. Others would be condemned to the galleys or the living tomb of the Inquisition's prisons. The entire day was a terrifying and magnificent display of the Church's power over life, death, and eternity. It was the climax of the entire inquisitorial process. As the sun would begin to set on this exhausting day of judgment, a final group of prisoners would be brought forth. These were the relapsed or unrepentant heretics, the ones deemed incurable. With solemn finality, the inquisitor would declare them officially relaxed to the secular arm, formally handing them over to the worldly authorities. The Church had passed its judgment, and its great act of faith was complete. Now, the final act of purification could begin. Fact 10. The final punishment began not with a spark, but with a quiet legal phrase. After the grand theater of the auto da fe, the condemned were handed over. The inquisitor would declare them relaxed to the secular arm. This was the ultimate bureaucratic fiction, the moral loophole that allowed the Church to kill without ever shedding blood. According to its own sacred laws, a priest could not take a human life. So, the Holy Office would simply declare the heretic to be outside of its jurisdiction, releasing them to the state, knowing full well that the state's only role was to carry out the execution. How can an institution that forbids killing become responsible for so many deaths? It did so by outsourcing the final, violent act, washing its hands of the affair while a pyre was being built just outside the city walls. The final journey was short. The condemned was led to the quemadero, the burning place. Here, the last and most infamous punishment awaited: burning at the stake. The symbolism of this method was deeply important to the inquisitorial mindset. Fire was, first and foremost, an agent of purification. It was believed that the flames would cleanse the very air of the heretic's spiritual contagion, a final, violent baptism to cauterize the wound they had inflicted on the body of Christ. The crowd would gather, their faces illuminated by the growing heat as the torch was brought forward. For the condemned, there was often one last, terrible choice. If they repented in these final moments, they were sometimes granted the mercy of being garroted, strangled with an iron collar from behind, just before the fire was lit. Their body would still burn, but they would be spared the agony of the flames. What is the purpose of a death that leaves nothing behind? Beyond purification, the fire served a crucial strategic purpose: total, annihilation. A buried body could become a shrine. The bones of a heretic could be dug up by their followers and venerated as the relics of a martyr, inspiring further descent. But fire erased everything. It left no body to bury, no bones to cherish, no tombstone to visit. It was a method designed to wipe the condemned from the pages of history, to turn their physical presence into ash and smoke, scattered to the four winds. This final, agonizing consumption by fire was the Inquisition's ultimate statement, that it held power not only over life and death, but over memory itself. As the flames consumed the last vestiges of the heretic, all that remained was the smell of smoke, the fear in the hearts of those who watched, and a chilling warning of the absolute price of defiance. Fact 11. The true legacy of the Inquisition is not written in rusted iron or cold stone, but in the chilling silence that follows a scream. When the smoke from the last pyre cleared and the ashes were scattered by the wind, what was left behind was not just a memory of suffering, but a blueprint for fear. The true power of the Holy Office lay not in any single instrument of torture. The rack, the strappato, the water cure, these were merely tools. The real weapon was the system itself, a cold, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly logical machine designed for the complete dismantling of a human being. It was a machine that began its work not on the body, but on the soul and the self. It could erase a family's name for 100 years with a simple yellow tunic. It could unravel a mind with nothing more than darkness and the slow, steady drip of water. It could sever a soul from God with a single Latin phrase. The genius of this machine was its justification. It was built by educated, pious, and intelligent men who believed with absolute certainty in the righteousness of their cause. They saw themselves not as tormentors, but as physicians of the soul. And their most brutal acts were framed as a form of divine mercy. This transformation of cruelty into a righteous procedure is the Inquisition's most enduring and disturbing lesson. It is the story of how a search for truth can become a license for tyranny, and how the stated goal of saving humanity can become a perfect justification for destroying it. The specific instruments are now relics in museums. The great public processions are the stuff of history books. But the architecture of that fear remains. The idea that a belief can be so pure that any method is acceptable to defend it. The power of a bureaucracy to strip individuals of their humanity and turn them into records on a page. And the seductive logic that says monstrous acts are necessary for the greater good. These ideas did not die with the last inquisitor. They are ghosts that still haunt the modern world. A timeless and chilling warning that the most terrifying chambers are not built of stone, but of certainty.